Scott Hamilton Kennedy, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Catherine Ann Couric. It's great to be with you. How are you? What's with the three names?
Yeah, what's with the three names? Katie, good to see you again.
Nice to see you both, and I so appreciated this film. Scott, you're the writer, director, and producer of this documentary called Shot in the Arm. What made you want to tackle this topic?
Oh boy, it started all the way back in 2018 when a doctor friend of mine said, Scott, what's your next film going to be? You should really take on these anti-vaxxers. And in my wisdom, in the fall of 2018, I said, oh no, why would I need to do that? They're going to burn out. We don't need to make a movie about them. Cut to spring of 2019, still a year before COVID, and here in beautiful New York City, actually in the Bronx, was the state of emergency around measles in the Orthodox Jewish community. State of emergency, right? And I thought, why is this happening? And I did a lazy Google search and saw that in 2000 we were on the road to eliminating measles in the United States because of the success of vaccines. So why is this happening? If we're close to eliminating it, like bye-bye, don't have to take the vaccine anymore, why is this happening? And I reached out to the wonderful Dr. Paul Offit at CHOP, Children's Hospital, Philadelphia, and I said, what's going on? He said, Scott, it's not very complicated, but it is nefarious that there are people out there that have come to be known as anti-vaxxers who scare parents into not vaccinating their children, and it's never a matter of if, it's a matter of when. If you lower those vaccine rates, that you're going to see a measles outbreak. So I thought, that sounds like a pretty important movie. So I started filming with Paul Offit. I filmed with Dr. Tony Fauci before he became Super Fauci. And I filmed with a lot of the people who are sort of the top of the pyramid on the anti-vax side. Robert Kennedy Jr., Andrew Wakefield, Dell Bigtree. And then COVID happened. We thought we had a pretty important movie. And then COVID happened. And for a minute, I thought, wait, maybe I don't have a movie. Because God forbid, these people known as anti-vaxxers stop doing what they're doing when we're in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic. That's not what happened. They got more ruthless and more determined and more successful, sadly.
Neil, what was it about this subject that made you want to be an executive producer? Because I know this is the second film that you two have done together.
Yeah, we collaborated. In the first film, I just lent my voice and my voice.
You have a nice voice, by the way.
And I consulted on some of the delivery of science that was in the film. In this particular film, when Scott approached me, he was very slick about it. He said, "Oh, Neil, I have this. Could you look at this script and look at this scene?" And I looked at it. It was brilliant. I said, "But I have comments," and there it is. So I got a few more, and as my comments built, then I was invited to be script consultant. And I guess I was way more opinionated than I should have been, because then I became executive producer. But I see as my major contribution the fact that he's a storyteller, and he also cares about science. But I care about how people learn science and how it's delivered to them and how they might receive it, or why they might reject it, or why they might not understand it. And so as I reviewed the script and the scenes, and I made multiple recommendations throughout, he took almost all of them. I mean, he was very responsive to what I was offering him.
What was it about the topic itself that made you want to be a part of it?
Yeah, so while I have no specific medical expertise, but I do have expertise in people misthinking science. And to me, it was almost like the people who think we never went to the moon. That's a whole community. They're the people who are sure that that we've been visited by aliens. That's an entire community. And so there's certain forces operating within those communities that I've had to think about and address and combat if we want objective truth to prevail in this 21st century America. And so some of those methods, tools, and tactics I found repeated in the anti-vaccine movement. It didn't matter to me that it was vaccines or moon hoaxers, or it's the same thing. You are denying objectively established truths by the methods and tools of science, and what can we do about that?
Scott, I want to ask you about how we got here, because I have a pretty active social media following, and they're very smart and interested, and the main question we got was, so where and when did this movement begin? Was it with Andrew Wakefield's 1998 paper?
I refer to Andrew Wakefield as the OG. but Paul Offa would say it started earlier, and I'm not going to be able to give definitive, but it was growing for a long time, but Andrew Wakefield at a minimum took it to a much higher place. So his study, that was him attempting to make a connection between the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, to autism, was fraudulent from moment one. He was hired by a law firm to find evidence to say that the MMR vaccine caused autism. Paid money to do that. He actually, we couldn't even squeeze it into the film, he actually took a patent out on another measles vaccine. So he was trying to double dip. So sadly, the paper was published in The Lancet, should never have been published in The Lancet, and it took 9 years to retract it. So in those 9 years, we all saw this happening, right? Oprah Winfrey had, people on saying that these terrible things about vaccines and autism. So the genie kind of got out of the bottle, the bad genie in this case got out of the bottle, it was finally retracted, but the damage was done.
And the damage was to particularly susceptible communities.
Yeah.
These are newborn families with newborns, mothers who are caring for their children, and they've seen their children become autistic, which in many cases you can watch it happen in the moment it takes place. And if that happened to be timed with a vaccine, then this becomes a correlation but not a causation. Right. But how you get someone to think otherwise. And one of the things I was delighted about the film was to see the sensitivity with which the lens of sensitivity that Scott used when approaching these people.
I thought a really important point came from Dr. Peter Hotez, who himself has a daughter with autism. And he explained that when the MMR vaccine is given, I guess it's at 1.5 years old.
That's right.
And usually autism presents itself when a child is 2.
Luckily, we now have better science that if you study it, you can see the signs of autism at a much younger age. But
I didn't know that. Interesting.
No, they have absolutely have the evidence for it now. But you're absolutely right. That is exactly how it happened. It was just a sad, perfect storm of science that the time that you get the vaccine and the time that you might notice that your child is autistic were close to each other.
And one thing you left out after Andrew Wakefield's study, which, if it were true, would be remarkable, it triggered many, many other studies to say, is that really true? Because that's how science works. Science is never the results of one person's research project, ever. It only becomes objectively true when multiple studies try to support it or can't support it. That's how science works. So a whole spate of studies followed that.
Around the world.
None of them could duplicate his results.
That's right.
And that's the sure sign of no causation at all. But if you only cherry pick his result and you say, well, he's a scientist and he's educated and he's got the MD, and that becomes your way to blame something else, maybe it's how we learn science in school that doesn't equip people for how to handle that situation. I don't know.
I was surprised that Wakefield has reemerged. I thought that he would skulk away in shame, having all this information revealed about his faulty science and the fact that he was taking money to produce these quote-unquote findings. But he is very much an active member of the anti-vax community.
I wish he would have had some shame. I have not seen any evidence that he has shame, sadly. But yes, he is still very much, he's seen as a...
We're not in the era of shame.
Yeah, we're not in the era of shame.
This is a different world.
We're in the era of the thing you point out all the time, that he's one of those people that says, I'm going to tell you what the establishment doesn't want you to know. I'm the one person who's going to tell you the truth about medicine. I'm going to tell you
it's
one
irresistible clickbait. When
right.
you think about it, you come across a video and the person says, here are my credentials, and I know something that the establishment doesn't want you to know. Boom, you're clicked in there. And that becomes your conduit to what you think is an objective truth, because the establishment doesn't have the charisma of the one person speaking eye to eye to you in a YouTube video.
Speaking of charisma, you also spend a lot of time profiling someone named Dell Bigtree, who is very charismatic and ebullient, if you will, when he speaks in front of all these parents. Tell us about him, because he has no medical background, really, except he was a producer on the show The Doctors.
Correct, yes. He is a very good communicator, very charismatic, but sadly, maybe he's using his superpowers for not good in this case, and I wish he would change his ways. He says in the film, when I'm asking him in 2019 about measles and science and vaccines, he says, well, measles isn't really, they say measles is deadly, but so is drinking water. If Ebola was sweeping the country, talk to me then. He said that in June of 2019. COVID comes, and you'd hope that maybe he would change his tune, but he did not. He doubled down and grew his audience and was very proud of growing his audience around disinformation. So I don't know what drives all of them, but there's definitely a big part of ego and industry. It's a business for them.
I was going to say he probably makes a lot of money doing this, doesn't he? He has a whole network and a whole organization that's producing films. And did you watch the film he made on Vaxxers?
Vaxxed, yeah.
Vax, sorry.
I did get through Vax that Wakefield directed and he produced. It's awful, and it is scientifically so invalid and just terribly, terribly manipulative.
But at the end of the day, the average person will see that film, and then there's Shot in the Arm, and we have to ask the question, how are they going to decide? Yes. These are two documentaries, right? And so how is one to decide? And Scott and I were chatting just earlier today that Scott would invite you to take his film and vet it yourself. Who are these people we were interviewed? Yeah. What is their background? What institutions do they represent? And when you have a foundation of objective truth, one wouldn't fear that level of scrutiny. Whereas if you build a house of cards and there's scrutiny, at some point you're going to say, well, you don't listen to them, you have to listen to us. All of a sudden you have to carve a space around it so that you will continue to believe misinformation. So that's, we need more methods and tools to make this judgment, especially in the era of the cesspool that we call social media.
How did COVID create an environment where anti-vaxxers became even more emboldened?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's another version of this perfect storm. It's who we had in office at that time, right? That somehow the Trump administration wants to take credit for the vaccine, but also support people who say the vaccine is awful. I don't even know how to wrap my head around that. But it was a perfect storm of cynicism that had been building long before COVID about institutions, about trust and expertise, and then people taking advantage of that and saying, COVID isn't, and they were two contradictory things. COVID isn't real, but you can fix it with vitamin C. So wait, which is it? Is it real, and you can fix it with vitamin C, or it isn't real? So it was a shame that it took cynicism around science and sort of married it to, I sadly have to use the word selfishness, around freedom, using freedom to really kind of hide selfishness, to say, I don't want to be told what to do. But we have a thing called the social contract, right? That we've all come to respect. It's outside of blue and red, right? These are these beautiful things in the social contract that we've decided to embrace to have a functioning society. And that really was broken during COVID.
I'm so glad you included that in the film. I guess the social contract would be the good of all versus the good for me as an individual, that you have to take some steps to protect everyone. Is that right?
It's wonderful. It's a wonderful way of putting it. And it's funny that you're finding the definition, because how often do we talk about it? Right? Neil and I are trying to remember when we talked about it. Maybe it was in a civics class in 5th grade or something like that. But yeah, that is exactly it. It's things that are written down. So it could be laws like don't drink and drive, or it could be things that have just become inherent. Be a decent neighbor, pick up your trash, be kind to people, right? Open a door for somebody. Don't take 2 parking spaces in New York City. Sorry.
Did someone do that?
So it is something that we've taken for granted, and in taking it for granted, we've forgotten about it a little bit. And now some people are taking it for granted to say, well, whose social contract? I don't even know what that means. I've heard Dell Bigtree actually say that. I don't even know what it even means. But it's something we must come back to and remember, that we wouldn't have this incredible, imperfect, functioning society in the United States and around the world that is safer and healthier and more equitable than it's ever been.
Watching this film reminded me how people I deeply admire, like Anthony Fauci and Paul Offit, have been demonized by this group of individuals. I mean, public servants, at their core. Tell me a little bit about Paul Offit and why he is almost the heart of the movie.
Yeah, Paul Offit's a special, special individual. To have actually I'd compare him to you, Neil, to have that level of intellect and humor.
And humanity.
And humanity, right? This balance that he's a very, very special doctor, scientist, communicator, citizen of the planet, with humility and a wonderful sense of humor. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is when he finishes talking to Wolf Blitzer and his phone rings and it's his mother.
Saying, "You look good, honey."
And it's just lovely. It's just such a beautiful, and his mom since passed, so I'm glad we have that little moment to remember her by. But he's just, one of the things I've learned through this journey, Katie, is the difference between the science community, the public health community, and those that are antis, is this what we're doing here? We're looking at each other, and there isn't like some nefarious thing behind it, right? Everybody I meet in public health is open, and they're honest.
And they're so committed.
So committed, solution-oriented, and then we have people that are saying they're evil and they're horrible and they're lying to you. Now let's look at an example of how wrong that is. During the early days of the vaccine, some of these doctors and nurses were being spit on, say they were murderers, don't get the vaccine. Then some of those people got COVID. Did those doctors turn them away? Did those nurses turn them? No, of course they didn't. They did their job. They tried to save their lives as best they could. And that shows you the integrity of that community.
I appreciated you using the video, the iPhone video of some of those people who got COVID who regretted not getting vaccinated. My producer, Julia, pulled this quote from a New York Times article. I want to read it and get your reaction. According to public surveys by the Pew Research Center, nearly 8 in 10 Americans still say they believe that scientists act in the public interest, a far higher level of trust than people give to politicians or the news media. Yet many Americans no longer have lasting relationships with primary care doctors, and social media influencers, often with little or no medical training, have rushed to fill the void. Do you think that's one of the reasons trust in science has eroded? The current healthcare system works against the old-fashioned doctor-patient relationship?
Interesting point.
I mean, it's
the doctor bag who shows up, at your doorstep.
Or even,
You're the family doctor.
Yeah.
The biggest part of it is probably the marriage of the internet being this window into everything that you really can, with tools, do your own research, and then social media, that you have this platform, you have this platform to communicate, but you also have this platform that is a confirmation bias nightmare. Confirmation bias being you look for things that you look for evidence that supports your worldview. So we can't leave all of that out. And again, it comes back to, Neil and I were joking about this earlier, God forbid, wouldn't it be amazing we had an app in our phone or on our watch that said, bullshit. Bullshit. Beep, 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 bullshit, right? And we agreed. Can we try to come to an agreed upon some tools that we can use, going similar to you comparing the two films or comparing two people speaking, between somebody who's an anti-vaxxer speaking on social media and me speaking on social media? What tools can my 15-year-old daughter use to distinguish between those two things, and then celebrate them and put them on our website and say, this is what we're using. Are you using those same tools?
What are other ways that we can restore trust in science, Neil? I know that 52% of U.S. adults say research scientists are bad communicators.
Okay.
Just a little over half, but I think one of the best science communicators on the planet, how can we restore trust in truth and facts in science?
Yeah, so that's an important fact. When I came of age in graduate school, it was just transitional, at least in my field. In the field of astronomy and astrophysics, we have quite a proud legacy of people who were in the public eye. Einstein himself had many books that he wrote for the public, but Richard Feynman, physicist, of course, but you get to Carl Sagan, where at the time, there was some blood on the tracks because it's well known within the Sagan world when he first agreed to appear on Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show. Wait, is that a documentary? No. Is it a serious interview? No. It's entertainment. His colleagues were saying, "What are you doing? You can't do that." Yes.
Right.
Yes. And the fact that he's in my field opened up doors, carved through the brush and bramble, so that when I step onto that landscape, I do not face that same criticism from colleagues, because they know at the end of the day that the public's awareness of what we do is just a greater benefit, especially since what I do, NASA and the NSF, it's tax money that pays for that. You have a right to know how that money is being spent. So my point is, we were, I think, early out of the box in caring about the public's exposure to the science we do. I can't say that about other fields. They were still poo-pooing anybody's attempt to write a book, to show up in a movie, to do any of this. And I think the time has come for this to be a fundamental part of what it is to even get your PhD. It has to be a portion of that exercise.
How about graduating high school?
A portion of that exercise when you become a scientist is go have some interviews with journalists and report back to us and see how that went.
One of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you all is because of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was featured in this documentary and has been a prominent figure in the anti-vaccine movement. You interviewed RFK Jr. for this documentary. He did not look super comfortable talking to you, but tell me about his role in all of this so people truly understand.
Oh boy. So Robert Kennedy Jr. has been in the fight for a long time. He says he got into it because a woman showed up at his door with evidence that MMR vaccine causes autism, and she wouldn't leave until he read the papers. He said he tried to get her to go away. She said she wouldn't leave until he read the papers. He read the papers finally and thought that in those papers he had evidence that mercury or other things in vaccines was causing autism. He clearly didn't, because the overwhelming science says that that is incorrect. But it started his mission into getting into the anti-vax thing. And he says it's because of that. He says it's because of evidence. I don't know why he does it, beyond it's clearly some version of ego, that he thinks that there's a bit of a God complex, that I'm the savior. There's a bit of a manipulation of the David and Goliath story. I'm David, pointing out that all these Goliaths are wrong. Big pharma, big food, big government, they're all wrong. I'm the only one telling you the truth. Sadly, the science doesn't support, the evidence doesn't support that argument.
What exactly was his role in this? Because he pretty much, as you said, denies it.
Right. So it was, again, perfect storm. These two babies died by human error. The prime minister stopped all vaccines. He was already vaccine hesitant because his grandson is autistic. So he already had a bit of that misinformation floating in his head. And he said, well, let's stop all vaccines if these two babies died. Fine, again, skeptical. Two babies died, let's look at it. Let's stop the vaccines. Then when he found out that it was just a human error, he should have brought the vaccines back.
But he didn't.
But he didn't right away. It took him a minute, but he did reverse it, and he did stop the outbreak.
But only after
a year. Yeah, it took a long time.
And during that year, how many kids were infected with measles?
5,000 cases. Yeah, it's awful. So Robert Kennedy Jr. heard about it, and this is where it gets squishy. Was he invited to Samoa? It looks like there's pretty definitive evidence that he was invited to Samoa by a person who's a very prominent anti-vaxxer there. He says that's not how it happened. Let's just say that we have the evidence that he went to Samoa. He went to Samoa with his wife, the actress Cheryl Hines. They met with the prime minister. I assume you know the prime minister changed his mind and got the MMR vaccine.
I have no idea. I never talked to the Prime Minister of Samoa about anything to do with vaccination.
We have a letter in which he wrote to the Prime Minister where he talks about vaccines. He met with anti-vaxxers there. There's pictures of him with these anti-vaxxers. So I plenty of evidence to say that he is not telling us the full truth about him not talking about vaccines. So then let's say, why aren't you telling us the truth about that? Because all he had to do was say, yes, I went there and said, this prime minister is dealing with a public health issue in the best way that he could. And then when he found out that it was a human error, he could have just said, oh, I'm sorry. It had nothing to do with the MMR vaccine. I'm really sorry. I hope we can get this taken care of. But he didn't do that. That's what he really shows his stripes, and you can see him kind of squirming in his seat when he's gone too far. It's like, did I lie there? Kind of
Well, there's hardly ever an admission of error
That's
when
it.
there's the occasion to do so. Andrew Wakefield hasn't, not that I've seen in any footage that I've been exposed to. So that's another way something's not real
He
there.
claims that he's not an anti-vaxxer.
I've heard him say that, and
I've
so
got an answer for that. So if he says it in the film, he says, I'm not anti-vax. They
Yeah.
use anti-vax to say that I'm crazy. But then I follow it up and I say, well, can you tell us one vaccine that has been a success for mankind? He says, oh, I don't think I can answer that question.
You also showed him at events where he was speaking.
Oh,
he was,
he said on the record.
hobnobbing with this other guy.
That's right. He said a statue should be built for Andrew Wakefield. But he said on the record, not in shot in the arm, he said on the record that there is no safe or effective vaccine out there. But this is the only question I want to keep asking, have the press ask him. If he says he's not anti-vax, tell us one vaccine you're pro. Because if I say that I am not anti-fruit, and I can't tell you one fruit that I like, I think I'm anti-fruit.
Let's talk about Robert F. Kennedy is President-elect Donald Trump's nominee to head up the Department of Health and Human Services. That includes the NIH, the CDC, the FDA. He has said he's going to replace corrupt officials with honest public servants. He would investigate and in a couple of months would find the cause of autism in children. How did you react when you heard that he was being tapped for this role?
I'll start with a snarky one. That he's a bit like a cockroach that just won't go away. I feel like I've had the evidence to see that he's not an honest broker since 2019. Some people had it earlier than that. But in terms of my journey with him and the telling of shot in the arm, I've had evidence since 2019, and it just keeps getting more definitive that he's not an honest broker. He does not respect nor stand by the tenets of science and democracy. And we can test him on that, right? He says, I'll change my mind if evidence is presented to me. Show me the evidence you've ever done it. He's never done it. We just said it earlier. I will admit that I'm wrong. I've never seen him admit that he's wrong.
How is he qualified, Neil, to fill this post?
So that's not how I think about the U.S. government. I think of the U.S. government as a juxtaposition, an ensemble of agencies. And those agencies have career people who work within them. The National Institutes of Health, there are career scientists there. They also fund science research and universities and other institutions. And so I never distract myself with who happens to be head of any agency, especially if they're an appointee, because they're in a political appointee, and that goes away with the political leadership.
But you can do a lot of damage.
It's possible, however,
Especially if he wants to clean house, Neil.
Well, okay, but
to fire
in the cleaning of the house, if you're going to fire people higher up, there's still everybody else who's actually doing the work. And that's who I align with as a scientist. These are people who have the integrity. To be a scientist comes with a certain amount of honesty and integrity about your work. And so that's there. And they're there before, during, and after whoever's head of the agency will come and go. It's the same with NASA. It's the same with all of these agencies. So, and all of Congress, well, the House gets revoted on every 2 years, the Senate, a third of them every 2 years, the President gets revoted on every 4 years, and all the appointments that are associated with it. These are not lifetime positions like the Supreme Court. So I have more confidence than others that the science as an institution in the country will survive.
And the institution of democracy even.
Will survive. I have more, maybe it's because, am I naive? Possibly, but I know many, many scientists deep within that are just trying to get their research done.
Are you as optimistic as Neil is, Scott? That
No.
he couldn't do serious damage because of the people who have worked tirelessly there every day and aren't going anywhere?
I cannot associate the word optimism with Robert Kennedy Jr. having anything to do with public health.
Well, what are you most worried about?
All of it. I mean, he is not an honest broker. He absolutely could have devastating influence on just vaccines being mandated for our children before they go to school.
Or he could have a coming to Jesus moment and realize.
Hold your breath on that one.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, these are educated people.
You're not one to usually go for hope. You're usually more one to go for data. I don't want to hope that he goes to have a come to Jesus moment. I love it. I would love to see it. I would love to use his communication skills for good.
He can't say the entire scientific establishment is corrupt. You can't do that. An individual can be corrupt. Maybe he'll swap them out. But the entire establishment
Yes.
that has 80% approval rate, which I think should be higher, but I'll take the 80, the Pew Research polls.
I've coined a phrase in the journey with Shot in the Arm that some of these people are not just corrupt, they're corrosive. Robert Kennedy Jr. isn't just corrupt. Andrew Wakefield isn't just corrupt, he's corrosive. He's corrosive to science, he's corrosive to these institutions that, in democracy and science, that have been remarkable, not perfect. No one's ever saying that they're perfect, and we have checks and balances to try to adjust to their imperfections. But by and large, it's been incredible that we have a functioning society like we do. I mean, we're in New York City. This place is a miracle that we can live with this many people on top of each other, and it just doesn't all cave in on itself. Or we could go another direction, and we could ask Robert Kennedy Jr. and everybody else that wants their freedoms, go take an island over, start over, 100% freedoms. Don't have to be told what medicine is. You get to use whatever food you want to eat. Let's see how that goes. A lot of dead people.
Let's talk about the overlap between the anti-vax movement and MAGA writ large. I thought it was fascinating towards the end of the movie that you drew parallels between the two groups, and that there was an anti-vax rally happening not far away from what was going on at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah. I wouldn't have included it in the film if that wasn't happening. So yes, there was a rally with Dell.
You were already wrapping the film before January 6th.
No, I was editing.
Editing, yeah.
We're still deep in it. We're still deep in editing.
Okay.
I would not have included January 6th in the film if Dell Bigtree and other anti-vaxxers, but especially Dell Bigtree, wasn't on the stage speaking on January 6th. And I've come to kind of bundle it as if I agree to tell your lie and you tell my lie, we're friends, right? So this is a catch-22 of science, right? That the antis will say, if you tell my lie, come on in. We on the science and like pro-truth side, we have to vet things, we have to have studies, we have to have meetings, and there's all this nuance. Wonderful, I believe in it, but it makes it much easier for this side. So, sorry I got away from your point about January 6th. It was very scary to see Dell Bigtree stand on the stage and put the two together with, again, not just corrupt, but corrosive.
How did he put the two together?
He said, I wish I could tell you that COVID was real. I wish I could tell you that Anthony Fauci cared about you. I wish I could tell you voting machines worked. And then he finishes with, and people care, which is like I don't know what that means, just like the ultimate cynicism. I'm the only one who cares, Dell Bigtree standing on stage. So he just bundled them together, and it's...
That was an exact quote, by
That's
the way.
pretty much word for word quote. And then the next day he says, it's not political, and blah, 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 and tries to dance back from it. But now he is vetting people for some of those jobs that you just described that Robert Kennedy Jr. might have power over.
Seriously?
That is correct. That's not me saying that. That is absolutely on the record that he is vetting people for those positions.
What do the two groups have in common? Massive anti-government, individual freedom is paramount, and a distrust in institutions, science on one hand, and government and elections, right, and democracy on the other.
It's hard for me not to use the word selfish. If you're presented with evidence that says what you are doing is not based on evidence and is not going to succeed at being the best for all and not just you.
That could harm other people.
That could harm other people. I don't know how you don't describe that as selfish, right? So if you're making a decision that is You only have evidence that it benefits you. I don't know why, because you could die too, but it benefits your mission. That is a selfish decision. So selfish is not a word to use in terms of communication. So I would like to go back to empathy, humility. Can we check ourselves before we wreck ourselves? Oh man, I just quoted Ice Cube. Can we check ourselves before we wreck ourselves? That means, can you pause and say, just because I feel this way, just because some clever person in my feed that I like told me to feel this way, doesn't mean that it's true, but it's much harder. It's so much harder to take that pause, look at the evidence, and God forbid, change your mind.
I'm curious what you think of this MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again.
It's clever.
Of course, it's not a monolith, but in general, what do you think of it?
Well, obviously, who wants to be against being healthy, right? I mean, it's sadly, and I think I've heard you discuss on some of your podcasts that with some people that maybe Robert Kennedy Jr. has some ideas that could be helpful, right?
Right. Why are people
obese
or chronic illness, and shouldn't we treat the root of the problem than treat the symptoms once they present themselves?
And a fantastic conversation to have if we're both honest brokers. And what I'm saying is Robert Kennedy Jr. doesn't come to the table as an honest broker. So I can't trust that he's going to use the best information to get to some of those answers, right? What he says about pesticides in our agricultural systems are dangerous because he doesn't follow the science. But it's easy to say, oh, he's against pesticides. Pesticides are toxic. That is an oversimplification of a very complicated conversation where a lot of people don't know that organic food has pesticides. They're just using organically based pesticides. That doesn't mean that they're not toxic, right? These things are complicated, and he's an artist at making something complicated very simple and usually not with the best information.
As the MAHA movement grows, the CDC is recording a dip in vaccination rates and a resurgence of measles, the most contagious of common childhood diseases. There have been 13 measles outbreaks in 2024 compared with 4 in 2023.
Whoa.
There you go.
Whoa. Well, I worry that we have to sink lower before people wake up to what role and value
That's dark.
objective truth and science will play in our health, wealth, and security. So I worry a little bit about that. And
How low?
I don't know.
You mean there has to be some terrible outbreak or
Like a
something?
100-year pandemic?
Or we see other countries rise up around us while we're sitting here fighting about who's getting vaccinated, and people are dying by not getting vaccinated or falling, lethally ill. That the other countries rise up and we're no longer at the table because we're in denial of the very science that put us on the map in the first place. And that has been quite a motivator in the past. When we feel a threat from the outside, and they're better at something that we had previously cherished about ourselves, that can be quite potent. So I worry that we have to sink lower before everyone wakes up to what role and value that science needs to play in our lives.
Did you learn anything about how to communicate with people who are anti-vaxxers or anti-science? Is there any reasoning with individuals? Somebody said, any advice, gentlemen, on how I talk to people who are part of the anti-vax movement?
It's a great question. Well,
I just ask them why.
Yeah.
I just ask why.
Yeah.
And then I say, have you considered this? That nobody wants to be lectured to or talked down to. As an educator, if someone comes up with an idea that's just otherwise crazy, I just ask the question. And if you do that with enough sensitivity, and if you do it in a humble way without flexing muscles, there's a chance that the person will rethink their posture.
Yeah, my add-on to that, and we're in the holiday season, so these wonderful conversations are going to be happening over holiday dinners. Connection. I'm still a rookie in the world of science communication, but I try to get better. But it's start with the connection. Don't start with data. So why have you come to that feeling about MMR vaccines? Why do you have that feeling about the COVID vaccine, and then say, well, what things do you trust in? We're sitting at this table and there's all sorts of science here to say that we're not afraid of eating that turkey or drinking that cocktail or the plane that we flew here in, all of these things. And then we agree on those. So we agree on those things that have brought us safety. Where's the disconnect with the same institutions that brought us the safety on the food we eat and getting on that plane are the same systems we used to determine if the risk assessment of vaccines? Where's the disconnect?